financial year. Wholesale price index is coming down because of oil price slowdown and food prices slowdown. And in fact, it is now negative. Some people think when the wholesale prices come down, it may lead to a slowdown in GDP growth. Yes, this year we are expecting 6.5% GDP growth, which is lower than last year, 7.2%. But that is the trend growth that India will continue to achieve. In fact, this number can be higher if export sector also performs, but that is going to be a challenge. That is why we are realistic in our expectations of what the economy can achieve. So in that sense, the wholesale price index reduction is not a drawback, not a drag on growth, but it is actually going to lower input costs for our businesses as well. And inflation expectations are coming down, which is a good news, and therefore inflation will moderate in FY24. Next slide, please. Now, we can move on. Next slide. So, what is it beyond FY23 and FY24? What are we looking at? Let's say up to FY30. The reason why we are more constructive for this decade is because businesses and banks had their problems last decade and they overcame them by repairing balance sheets. Basically, in the new millennium, there was a lot of optimism post 2002. Excess lending, excess borrowing, excess capital flows, BRICS was the rage of the world, and therefore there was a boom in India, both investments, exports, everything, a boom in growth, boom in credit. But eventually that turned out to be unsustainable. So we know that in 2012-13, the rupee crashed, current account deficit went to 5% of GDP, and India experienced 5 consecutive years of double-digit inflation rates. And then the rest of the decade, up to 2020, turned out to be a decade of balance sheet repair in the banking system, in the non-banking system, and in the corporate sector. So basically now we have entered the third decade of the new millennium with better balance sheets, stronger balance sheets, both in the corporate sector and in the banking sector. There is willingness to lend, willingness to borrow. What you see on this slide is the debt to GDP ratio coming down in the second decade. That is what I mean by balance sheet repair. Leverage ratios came down. Now, both banks and corporates are in a position to re-expand their balance sheet. And that is good news for investments, that is good news for employment and income growth as well. Next slide, please. And you see that in the bank's non-performing asset ratio. You see that in their overall capital adequacy ratio, which is double the minimum norms of 8 to 9% of risk-weighted assets. So clearly, there is a better appetite and better ability to lend. Next slide. And you can see that in the credit data, growth in bank credit to agriculture, industry, services, and personal loans, all of them are growing collectively at about 16% year on year. And specifically to MSME sector, the growth rate is a sustainable 12% as well. So clearly, the strength of the balance sheets is now encouraging and incentivizing the banks to expand their balance sheets. And that is beginning to happen. That's a good news. Next slide. And investment activity, we don't simply track investment activity by looking at the capital formation data, which comes only once a year. You track it by looking at the capital goods index of production in India, which is the blue bar. And then you look at the construction and machinery index production. And then on the right side, you can see that every single sector except 3 of them increased their overall capital investment in FY23. For example, the hospitality sector to 2.9 crore employees. How do we contribute? In fact, one of the things that governments across the country have to internalize and continue to internalize is that fiscal prudence is actually fiscal stimulus. And the reason is, the more we stick to fiscal prudence, interest rates come down. When interest rates come down, benchmark interest rates of the government borrowing comes down, interest rates in the private sector also come down. And lower interest rates is the best possible economic stimulus one can give. So in that sense, fiscal prudence is not something that is a negative for growth, it's actually a positive for growth. Okay, so that is why I think it's we adhere to the fiscal deficit reduction track of 4.5% of GDP by FY26. In fact, what is not shown in this, but in Chapter 3 of the Economic Survey, which came out on January 31st, we have also written that primary deficit and revenue deficit came down much more sharply in the last 3-4 years in spite of the pandemic spending. And the quality of the government spending between revenue and capital has improved. 5 years ago, revenue was 88%, capital was 12% expenditure share. Today, revenue expenditure is 78%, capital expenditure is 22%, a 10 percentage point shift. So, and you can see that roughly capital expenditure directly and indirectly put together that the union government facilitates has gone up by 3x from 4.5 lakh crores to 13.7 lakh crores budgeted for this financial year. Next slide, please. And clearly, tax buoyancy helps the government do both welfare expenditure as well as capital formation. Corporate tax and personal income tax revenues are on the higher side. But more importantly, for the current financial year, and that is what is important news, is that we have not assumed unrealistic growth numbers in this personal and corporate income tax. Because we know that the growth rate this year will be lower compared to the last 2 years, because last 2 years were catch up from the pandemic. So we have assumed a very realistic 10.5% nominal GDP growth in the budget compared to 15+% last year and 19+% the year before. And on that, we only assume a tax buoyancy ratio of around 1, which is lower than the historical average. So in that sense, the assumptions made in the budget with respect to growth and tax buoyancy are extremely realistic. And that is why we are able to consistently surprise ourselves pleasantly on the GST numbers side as well, which is rising from 1 lakh crore on average 3-4 years ago to an average of 1.6 lakh crores per month in the current financial year. Next slide, please. Now, I spoke about the big change this decade compared to last decade, which is the capital formation, the balance sheet strength of banks and companies, which is going to drive investment growth. I mentioned to you earlier that investment growth was sluggish in the last decade. This decade, it is going to be a positive contributor. The second positive contributor to growth this decade is this digital transformation of India, public digital infrastructure. All of us know about UPI, but more importantly, it is not just about the UPI, but also about account aggregators, open network, digital commerce, etc. And the statistics are showing that the online usage in India has put it well ahead of the largest digital economies with respect to digital payments and in terms of the number of e-commerce customers from tier 2 towns, etc. So basically, overall, what is happening is that the digital economy is contributing to financial inclusion, formalization, and expanded market opportunities. In fact, so much so that the Economist newspaper wrote 3-4 months ago in January that in few years' time, pavement vendors and hawkers in India would have become formal enterprises because of the way that the economy is formalizing. Because once you formalize, then you get access to financial services and you get access to markets. You plug yourself into the larger ecosystem. And that is why my own personal assumption is that, and it needs to be backed up by empirical analysis, I admit, my assumption and expectation is that capital investments by businesses, which was absent last decade, will add about 0.3 to 0.5% to growth. And this also, digital economy will add another 0.3 to 0.5% to India's GDP growth. That is why the trend growth of Indian economy, as mentioned by IMF, World Bank, etc., is about 6%. That is, this is the sustainable growth rate according to their models. I am willing to add another 0.5 to 1% to this number based on these two differential factors. One is this decade, investments are going to be better. Second, the digital transformation of India will also be making its own contribution. So together, the 6% that is the baseline number that international agencies put out, I am willing to add another 0.5 to 1% to that baseline number. And my optimism stems from these two factors: capital investments by businesses and digital transformation of India. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned to you, formalization of the economy is happening through these various enablers. Digital commerce, employment opportunities for informal workers through the e-Shram portal, capital needs for vendors through the PM Swanidhi, registering businesses for credit growth, the Udyam portal, GSTN and FASTag, because the Open Credit Enablement Network, OCEN, means if you can use your GST invoices as a collateral for getting working capital loans. So that is beginning to happen. In fact, I don't know if many of you noticed in this year's budget presented on February 1st, that large businesses cannot claim their payments to MSMEs as a tax deductible expenditure unless you actually have made the payment. So that is a very big behavioral shift to ensure that MSME growth is not stymied by absence of working capital. And account aggregators, with our consent, financial institutions can share information about us with our consent, and that will enable us to access very different financial products from many institutions without having to go through the drudgery of paperwork. Next slide, please. When it comes to the labor market, India has the quarterly periodic labor force survey, which shows that the unemployment rate, which peaked at 20.8% during the first quarter of 2021, has come down below 7%. And if you look at the EPFO registrations, which is for workers earning 15,000 rupees per month or below, has been rising. Net registrations, this subtracts those who are leaving the workforce as well. So net registrations have been rising, which is a good sign of job creation at low wage categories. Next slide, please. Moving on. So in terms of the various industry reforms, I don't want to read out everything that is out there. As I mentioned earlier, while the government has done many things to make ease of doing business, it is important to remember that this is a work in progress. Much more remains to be done. And for example, as a system of government, not just the union government, across states and across local governments, in fact, it is my pet theme that we might have divested 3% from LIC, but we have to divest from another LIC. What is that? Any guesswork? We have divested 3% from LIC, the corporation. The other LIC is licensing, inspection, compliance. So we need to divest from the other LIC as well. And that is an ongoing exercise. I mean, in the sense that the more and more we let businesses take legitimate decisions without the rules being prescriptive, rather than by merely keeping them principle-based, we will be unleashing the creative potential of Indians, whether it is businesses or individuals. And this is a ongoing responsibility of governments at all levels, union, state, and local. Next slide, please. And logistics efficiency, based on the World Bank parameters of logistics index, India's performance has improved across several logistics parameters, because logistics is basically the last mile connectivity and the cost of getting goods across the borders, and that is what will make our exports competitive. And of course, there is much action that remains to be taken by businesses also in terms of R&D spend and quality control as well. Next slide, please. And in case of the startup ecosystem, there are close to 100,000 recognized startups in India, with more than 43,000 led by women. 32% compounded growth rate in jobs generated by startups between 2018 and 2022. Over 60% of the 326 incubators come from non-metro cities, while 70% are in cities and towns which are not even state capitals. And of course, many of us know about the unicorns. Unicorns are not as important as the overall ecosystem. Unicorns may be a case of valuation growth for some companies which have $1 billion of valuation, which is fine. Unicorns are good, give a good feel. But more than that, from a country standpoint, the startup ecosystem is now permeated to Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, and that's a good story, because everywhere educational institutions have incubators, accelerators, and their own programs to groom entrepreneurs. And that is something which is going to serve us well in the coming decade as well. In fact, I am not including the potential of startups in my 2 additional growth boosters. I should probably be adding this third one as well as a growth booster. Next slide, please. So outlook for the near term, risks are more balanced. So as I mentioned, notwithstanding all this story, we are realistic about the growth prospect. It will be 6.5% as per RBI, as per the Ministry of Finance. And if we can sustain 6.5 to 6.8% for the rest of the decade, given global conditions, it will be a very creditable achievement on the part of the Indian economy, given what is going on in the rest of the world in terms of geopolitical tensions, supply chains being reconfigured, and the last 30 years of globalization slightly taking a retreat, countries intent on reshoring, and countries intent on encouraging domestic manufacturing. US's Inflation Reduction Act makes the US businesses set up shop back in the US to enjoy the government subsidy. So there is a lot of structural changes going on after 35 years of emphasis on globalization. Now there is a rethink, re-examination. These things happen because most of these things happen in a cyclical manner. So we have to be prepared for that. That is why we are not saying that we will be able to grow at 8%, 9%, because export growth is going to be a problem given the external situation. If we can achieve a steady 6.5% over the remainder of the decade, with occasional opportunities for 7+ growth, and while continuing to focus on improving the domestic economic fundamentals and the ease of living, ease of doing business, then we will be able to reduce our dependence on global growth, and whatever comes through export growth will be an icing on the cake for us. Next slide, please. So with that, I just want to end my presentation, but I want to reassure you that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there are plenty of challenges. In fact, the economist Joan Robinson in the UK told her student, Dr. Amartya Sen, in 1960s, whatever you say about India, the opposite can be equally true, right? I mean, which means we were a $280 billion economy in 1993, and we are now a $3.4 trillion economy 30 years later, in spite of the currency depreciating from 30+ rupees to 80+ rupees right now, right? So we have been able to, notwithstanding all the surface noise, we have continued to make steady progress, and it is because we have addressed issues. But then the problem is, once you address issues, our aspirations and reference points keep rising. That is human nature. You get into an unreserved compartment, you are very happy if you get a foot in the door. And then after a few minutes, you want to get a seat, and then after a few minutes, you want to get a berth. So this is how aspirations keep shifting, reference points keep shifting. We need to be aware of it, that it is not something that we can sit back and stand on our and be satisfied and rest on our laurels. We have to work on addressing skilling issues. Artificial intelligence is something that can be harnessed, that can also be destabilizing for certain categories of workers, whether it is services or manufacturing. We need to make sure that the demographic dividend is indeed a dividend, and that needs emphasis and investments on skilling. We need to make sure that we address energy security, because the Western world is keen on energy transition, net zero, controlling carbon emissions. But we need to make sure that we have enough energy available to power our growth, while at the same time minding the climate situation. Whereas when they were growing, they didn't have to worry about the emissions. So we have multiple challenges, but these are, I would call, opportunities and low-hanging fruits, which is what gives us the upside. From what we have already done so far, we have maintained macroeconomic stability. We did not overspend during the pandemic, so that our macroeconomic fundamentals are in good shape. We are on track to grow at 6+%, 6.5% on average for the remainder of the decade, but we can do better, and we need to continue to strive to make sure that economic growth translates into better well-being and standards of living for all our citizens, and that is the goal. Thank you very much.
Now we have the industry interaction with Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran as well as Shri Kamlesh Varshini. So it's over to the audience for the Q&A. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir, for that very exhaustive and comprehensive presentation. It is heartening to note that the economy is a sweet spot, but
I'm Vijay Kumar from GeoJet Financial Services. It's heartening to note that the Indian economy is doing exceedingly well, particularly the growth, the inflation dynamics, and the macro stability. 7.2% GDP growth last year and 6.5% projected for this year are good. But then this growth is largely driven by government capex, not by private capex. Our manufacturing capacity utilization has been hovering around 75% for more than a year now. So why is it that capex is not happening? Private capex is not happening. Only private capex can sustain this growth. One more supplementary question to this. This China Plus One policy, we are seeing supply chains being shifted. I recently read that Vietnamese exports of smartphones is more than 3 times that of India. Of course, India is doing very well. So why is it that a small country like Vietnam is doing exceedingly well and we are not up to the mark there?
No, I think both are fair questions. First of all, I did show that capital formation by the private sector in FY23, barring 2 or 3 sectors, have actually been very positive. So, in fact, we track, based on one private sector bank data, bottom-up cash flow-based data of 3,023 companies, a consistent sample. Because it is a cash flow statement, it is filed twice a year by the companies with the regulator. So right now we only have data for the first half year, April to September. In 2021, these 3,023 companies, the same sample, spent 2.1 lakh crores on capital formation. 21-22, it was 2.7 lakh crores. In 22-23, it is 3.3 lakh crores. It's rising. And also I showed you granular data for several sectors and industries where capital formation has indeed picked up. And that is the reason why the capital formation to GDP ratio has gone up to 34%. So it is beginning to happen. It is no longer a prospective story. It is a current reality. So I expect that to continue. That is why I specifically mentioned that one of the differentiators, one of the growth boosters this decade is going to be capital formation because it's already underway. Now, on your second question about China Plus One, again, these things do not get decided that quickly by companies. Status quo is a very powerful force. I mean, even if, for example, I am dissatisfied with a particular job and I have to relocate to another place, there is plenty of considerations that I need to weigh, not just my own job prospect. So when I consider all things together, I may still choose to live with my current status quo if overall there are too many things I will be upsetting in the process. And also, we need to understand that China will also be doing whatever it can to persuade those companies to stay as well. And the cultural similarities between China and Vietnam, other countries, are relatively much closer for them to be able to shift easily. But all that being said, about a couple of months ago, the Wall Street Journal carried an article called "Welcome to the New Factory Floor of the World." And which country they were referring to? India. And it is beginning to happen, but many countries, many companies, for whatever reason, will go about it rather quietly rather than very noisily for multiple reasons. And I think we will be seeing it in the data. Last year, once again, as I mentioned, other countries are not sitting quiet. The United States came out with this Inflation Reduction Act, which subsidizes a lot of industries very heavily to set up shop in their own country. So FDI as a whole, globally, declined in 22-23 because of oil price shock, because of interest rate increases, but also because of countries wanting to reshore. So we have to compete with all these other developments as well. But definitely, I think you will begin to see that in the data. What we are seeing as trickles of anecdotes, we will see them in the data in the years to come. Thank you.
I'm Kupuram, Chairman Kaya Board. So you have referred emission now, that you mean that is global warming. So what will be the scope for the eco-friendly products in export? Of course, export is going to be a problem. That is, we will have some problems in export. That is, it will be not that easy. What will be the scope for eco-friendly products, like that is our agro products of our nation, that is India? What will be the scope in that export?
I think it is difficult for me to give a specific answer about specific products, but definitely eco-friendly or environment-friendly or emission-friendly products will have a huge advantage in especially developed country markets. But then the amount of the nature of accreditation, the nature of quality controls, all that you have to pass to be able to get that label and sustain them, that will also go up. So the market for eco-friendly, environment-friendly and carbon emission-friendly products will be there, will be rising in future. So you have a huge opportunity there. But at the same time, those countries will also be raising the bar on the standards that we need to meet to be able to enjoy this market access. So it is going to be a double-edged situation. There will be a market, but there will also be higher tests to pass.
So there's an increasing belief that it's a Goldilocks moment for Indian economy, and after listening to your presentation, my belief is only added to it. I have two questions. I know you did mention the risks in passing. Can we have risks in passing? Yeah. Can we have a little more about what are the possible risks which is possible? Second is something which is people talking about is the rich-poor divide in the economy is increasing phenomenally. Though the top 2%, 3% is growing, and there are people who are getting out of the formal sectors, they are struggling with their businesses. My understanding is correct, please.
I think both are fair questions. As I said at the very beginning, it may appear that we have lots of boxes that are ticked in the right place, whether it is growth, all-round sectoral growth, or inflation, external balances, foreign exchange reserves, etc., etc. But as I said, we need to work hard to sustain it. The risk factors, as I mentioned right now, as we are speaking, the risk factor is the sustainability of the monsoon in terms of sentiment and food availability and inflation. And the medium-term big risk is, of course, globally, which applies to India even more so, is energy security in the face of emission reduction, mitigation goals. So that is a very important, affordable, reliable energy is a critical input for making sure that the manufacturing share of GDP grows in the country. And that will be affected by the need to maintain the net zero goals as well. Because when we talk of renewable energy, which is plentiful in this country, at the moment the storage technology is still in its early stages. So if we consider storage cost, then the equation changes. So we need to have options between fossil and non-fossil fuels. And we need to be able to also carry the rest of the world along with not only our priority, it's also a priority for the rest of the global south as well. So energy security is the most important risk in the medium term, while in the near term, it is the monsoon risk and so on. The other, I wouldn't call them risk factors, but they are important challenges to address. As I mentioned some of them, it is basically to ensure that the lost years of schooling and learning from the pandemic are made up. I think it's very important. And I also mentioned that from the state government's perspectives, we need to make sure that the DISCOMs are viable. And that will be an important input into ensuring adequate power supply, reliable and affordable power supply. DISCOM viability is an important issue. And the other important thing is, apart from learning, also learning to adapt and handle the impact of technological developments like AI, etc., whether it is, because we are a labor-intensive economy, to what extent finding this right balance between labor substituting capital or labor productivity enhancing capital. That is something we are going to have to manage very well. And then, of course, making sure that we do have a vibrant MSME sector, which at the moment we don't really have. I think these are all, I wouldn't call them risk factors, I would call them challenges or work in progress. Now, coming to your second question about inequality. Look, most of the studies that look at inequality do not take into consideration taxes and transfers, fiscal transfers. In the United States, for example, the Congressional Budget Office puts out a report that comes with a 2-year lag called Distribution of Household Income. It's available on the internet. So, for example, for 20 2020, you would have got the report in October 2022. And if you look at that, pre-taxes and transfers, the inequality measures, income distribution across the top 1% and the balance 99%, across the 5 quintiles, and you look at it post-taxes and transfers, it is chalk and cheese. It's very different. In the case of developing countries, such data are not so easily available. However, Tulane University did a study for India, but they have data only until 2011-12 because we didn't do the consumption survey in 2017-18. So the next consumption survey that comes out, they will be able to update it. They showed that, and this paper came out only last year, and they showed that if we take into consideration the various welfare measures that the government of India is putting out, then the Gini coefficient is substantially lower for India. So what we are talking about is, when we talk about inequality measures, we do not fully account for the role that fiscal transfers and taxes play. If we do that, then the nature of the debate will be different.
Sir, your presentation has been excellent. We are all very happy to know that India continues to grow at a much faster rate than what it has been in the last few years. But at the end of the day, what matters is, you see, the common man. The poverty index globally, if you take it, we are still hovering around the bottom 20 or bottom 30 or even lower sometimes. So effectively what matters is the per capita income, the consumer prices, it continues to grow, and the inflation rate, and also the employment rate. So when are we going to reach some comfort level on these parameters?
That is what I spoke about in the presentation. So yeah, I mean, the inflation rate this time around compared to in the past episodes, we peaked at 7.8%, whereas our range was 2 to 6. So our overshoot was about 1.8%, and then we have come down. And then compared to other countries where their target was 2, but they went to as high as 10%. So I think after and then when it comes to employment, yes, the unemployment rate was 21% in the first quarter of the pandemic year. Now it is down to 7%. And I also showed you that the agricultural and non-agricultural rural wages are growing at high single digits. And with inflation dropping below 5%, then the real wage growth will also be positive. And as capital formation picks up, which was, I said, largely sluggish in the second decade, as it happened in the first decade, it will lead to employment gains and income gains. So, and our per capita income has indeed grown, both in real terms and nominal terms. I mean, today the per capita income is about $2,500, and when we're talking about GDP of $300 billion about 30 years ago, on a population of probably 1 billion or 1.1 billion, you can do the math. It was hardly about $300 or $400. We are now talking about $2,500. And definitely that has outpaced inflation. So the reason why we continue to feel relatively unfulfilled, and that's a good feeling to have, because that is what keeps us striving, is, as I mentioned earlier, as we achieve milestones which in the past were important indicators, our reference points also keep shifting higher. So, but overall, the direction and the trajectory are in the right track. And we should also remember that we have faced 4 years of unprecedented successive shocks. And as I mentioned earlier, we only have to look at our own neighborhood and even some of the developed countries to look at the kind of impact it has had on their standards of living. Countries which were much higher than us in terms of per capita GDP and were considered middle income countries are now actually facing the prospect of slipping down even further. So I think both in relative sense and in absolute sense, it has been a creditable achievement to maintain stability in the face of such once-in-a-century shocks. And second, to lay the foundation for this to continue to help us grow and kind of make up for the second decade when growth rate was somewhat on the lower side due to the balance sheet problems I mentioned earlier. So my hope is that the third decade will compensate for some of the feeling that we should have grown faster than the second decade, which was stymied by the balance sheet issues.
So I'm from the spice export industry. I just want to know recently some of the subsidies that we were getting for the export, for the MSMEs were taken off. And, do you have any specific policies to boost export of, traditional commodities like spices and all?
I wouldn't be able to comment on that. The government announced recently a foreign trade policy. So I think this is a question that is probably better directed at Ministry of Commerce. But Kamlesh, do you have anything to add? Okay. For your comments. What is the 20% tax we're talking about? The 20% tax collection at source on the LRS. I think as was mentioned, I think some measures are being contemplated that would mitigate the tax collection at source. It's still being considered. It will be coming out soon. And as far as your point about certain RBI procedures, definitely you should write to them or let us know. We will take it up with them. You have anything more to add? Yeah.
So just to clarify, probably startup when you are talking about, so startup will not be taking money out, and if it is taking the money out, it will not be under LRS. So that 20% TCS is not going to affect startup. Probably what you are trying to say is that the fund which startup is receiving, and that's a different provision, that is not 20%, that's the angel tax provision. There were some changes in that angel tax provision, but ministry has come out with a lot of notifications and have given draft rule for consultation, how in genuine cases this angel tax will not apply. So those consultation papers are already out, and based on feedback, the final rules will be drafted. So all the concerns of genuine investors in startup, whether it's a venture capital fund or whether it is alternate investment funds, coming from a regulated jurisdiction, all that is being taken care of. New valuation methodologies have been provided as was suggested by the industry people. So that is being taken care of. So probably I thought I will just make these two are different provisions just to make it clear.
Can I have a question, please?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, sir, I'm talking about a dual edge sword kind of thing. Something that's both an opportunity as a challenge. One is that India's labor force participation rate has come down below 40%. At the same time, we have the largest unemployed youth force in the world. So what do you suggest or advise the government on how to, tackle this? Thank you.
I don't think that the labor force participation rate has come down below 40%. If anything, it is now, according to my understanding, it is about 51%. And I'm also not in agreement with you that we have the world's largest unemployed youth population. I don't think we both are talking from the same statistics in the first place.
Yes, I'm Neil from WebCRS. So basically, as I see, there is a plunge in VC investments in startups last 2022 earlier. And have the aspect of 18 billion NRIs outside our country. Where are they investing when they make money and send money to India? Are they investing on land, properties and other things? Or is there anything to boost on inspiring them to invest in Indian businesses and Indian MSMEs so that more and more entrepreneurships develop here and more employment generates here? These many people, we just look at the kind of money they probably send to India. But if it's just on property and other things, other than that, help them focus on to investing in businesses in India. Is there any numbers available on that?
I think we have the breakdown of, we aggregated on that basis. NRIs alone and which of whether they are sending money for consumption purposes, which they send to their families, and then for property versus other direct investments and portfolio investments. I don't think whether you have a category specifically looking at NRI, so I don't know if I have the data to be able to answer your question.
Right. But is there any models that we can look at in helping them?
I will have to, I'll have to come back to you, not immediately, but looking at your question, it will be difficult. Yeah.
One thing is there, so far as portfolio investment is concerned, the gift city which has come up, now it is doing very well. So that is definitely one area which has come up where our non-resident Indians can invest through because it has, I can tell you, the type of tax concessions that have been given to the gift city is taking the best treaty into mind. So, so far as tax efficiency is concerned, now it is equally tax efficient as any other financial jurisdiction. But as Sir just said, that there is always a status quo inertia, So those things we are trying to overcome now. But that could be a very good area where Indians, non-resident Indians, can invest into India through Gift City. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes.
To attract investments from their families and relatives living overseas. So we need to, what I'm saying is, before we respond, we need to understand the current distribution of how these investments are flowing, where they are flowing, and what percentage, and so on, to be able to then think about specific measures. I don't have that information right now offhand.
Gift City can invest to startup through, AIF1 and AIF1 goes to venture capital and AIF also startup, and AIF2 also goes to other private equity. So, that is also a source of funding for, part of the investment. In fact, that is one question which Sir had asked was about, environment. So, there are specific investors today in the world who want to invest only in ESG compliant industry. And a lot of venture capital has happened there. Like Sir said, that now entrepreneurship is happening in tier 2 and tier 3 city because of new startups. And that is leading to formalization of economy at a village, and district level. So this could be one area that if you have an economic friendly products which are going to sell, that of course is the first thing that it is going to sell. Then you will find investors. You start a startup, you will find investors who are willing to invest only in those industries.
Any more questions? The last question. Please give the mic.
Attract capital flow. Of course, FDI is actually slowed down, and FDI, we have had 2 bad years, but things are improving. What about inclusion of India in the international bond indices? It's been worked on for quite some time. What is happening on that regard?
It's a fair question. So by and large, most of the FDI sectors are on the automatic route now, and that is over the years, FDI norms have been liberalized. And even for bond investors, RBI has placed all the new sovereign bond issuance under the fully accessible route. The fully accessible route. So therefore, just as in the equity investors case, today a specific bond issue of Government of India, which RBI manages, is open for 100% subscription by the foreigners in theory, except that they want the bond index inclusions to happen. But then we need to be careful about the medium-term implications. Sometimes there are sudden stops and sudden surges of flows. We need to be doubly sure about it. So that is why we haven't closed the door on that, but we are looking at ways to make this happen in a manner that there is no medium-term instability issues at this point. Now, as I mentioned, the FDI flows, again, yes, there was a decline both in gross terms and in net terms, but this is a global phenomena because global FDI flows declined last year. And but I think as interest rates peak in the developed world and may even start to come down in the course of the second half of our FY23, etc., I have a feeling that these flows will start to improve and do better than FY23. But the question of making investments attractive or capital flows attractive, we also need to keep in mind the issue of level playing field between domestic and overseas investors. So it's a continuous balancing act. Yeah. Thank you.
So it's done? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. So on behalf of ASSOCHAM, ASSOCHAM as well as KMA, we would like to thank guest come over here as a token of respect. So I would like to request Shri Raja Sethunath, Chairman of ASSOCHAM Kerala State Development Council, to hand over the memento to Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran as a token of respect. Now I request Ms. Pooja Aluwalia, Assistant Secretary General ASSOCHAM, to hand over a small memento to Shri Kamlesh Varshane. Now I request Dr. Nirmala Lilly, President of Kerala Management Association, to present the memento to Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran. So now we have come to the close of the event. Now I would like to request Ms. Pooja Aluwalia, Assistant Secretary General ASSOCHAM, to give away the vote of thanks.
Good evening. I would like to thank all of you for joining us and making time for us today. This was a very insightful discussion on this holistic socio-economic growth of the country, and I concur with Sir that improved capital investments and industrialization will help us increase our growth rate much further, even in the face of all the challenges that do exist domestically and more so globally. Special thanks to Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran, Chief Economic Advisor, and Shri Kamlesh Varshane, Joint Secretary, Ministry of Finance. Your insights will help the industry better align itself to the growth vision of the country. We hope to continue that India continues to be a bright spot in the global economy through concerted efforts of the policymakers, academia, especially the industry and the Indian citizens. On behalf of ASSOCHAM, I extend a special thanks to Dr. Lilly and Dr. Raja Sethunath for their immense support in putting this together, and thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll have one group photo. Group photo.